Red alert. Red alert.
This week's cartoon is of our good friend Atheist Pig. He is clearly out of the country on a safari, hence the pith helmet, and has stumbled upon a poor starving child. He stops for a moment and tells the child, "Buck up, little guy. All my Christian friends say that God has a special plan for you." But Mr. Pig is saddened when a trio of vultures begin to feast on the poor child. The cartoon leads the viewer to then conclude that it was either God's plan for the child to suffer and be eaten by vultures, or more likely, God does not exist. Since our pig is named Atheist Pig, I'm going to assume the latter. Bad stuff happening to good people has always been in the arsenal of arguing atheists. In philosophical circles, it is referred to as the evidential problem of evil. That is, the haphazard occurrences of evil fit more rationally into the atheist worldview of there being no God than the theist worldview that there is a loving God that cares for each and every one of us. But as much as this may shock many atheists out there, theists are capable of rational thought too. You just may have not met one yet, but I promise they exist. To this problem, theists rationalize with the greater good defense. For example, many evils may lead to greater goods that can only have occurred because of a particular warranted evil. The intense suffering is thus justified in order to achieve this greater good. Well, what of our poor starving child? What was the greater good that came out of the child's death? The child is dead, and thus no further good can be had. While one may argue that the plight of a particular person can cause a ripple effect of repercussions in the rest of the world. I can't help but point out that this image very closely resembles Kevin Carter's Pulitzer Prize-winning photo of the 1993 Sudan famine, in which he captured a vulture apparently stalking a little starving girl. Granted, there are multiple accounts from people that were there who argue over the circumstances of the photo. For instance, since the photo was taken at a feeding center, the vultures were there to collect scraps of food. It only appears the vulture is stalking the little girl because of the perspective of the shot, which was orchestrated by the photographer. The child was only alone because the parents went to grab corn being passed out by relief workers. Some accounts say Carter chased the vulture away after the shot. Other accounts say the vulture was so far away in reality the child was in no danger while the parents were away. But regardless of the true circumstances surrounding the photo did bring enormous amounts of attention to the Sudan crisis and prompted an increase of aid to the area. Thus, a greater good came from the circumstances of this image. The character in our cartoon may also hypothetically bring about greater goods to others through their suffering. Now, some may argue that these greater goods to others are not justified if the victim themselves does not experience the greater good. This is, of course, overlooking the Christian worldview. After all, if we're talking about God, then we should also likewise be discussing heaven. Heaven being that place of union with God where all pain and suffering is no more, and hence a greater good. The child dying can even be seen as a form of mercy, considering the blissful eternity of heaven that awaited him instead of suffering any longer. We tend to overlook that sometimes God's mercy and love may involve, killing us. Yet an atheist may argue that for the greater good rebuttal to work, there must be greater goods evidenced. Surely millions of other innocent lives have also met their ends through pointless evils which have delivered no greater goods. But this is where skeptical theism comes into play. Skeptical theism argues that we have no adequate reason to argue that there are no greater goods when our cognitive capabilities are so limited. This might be hard for many of you atheists to accept, but you don't know everything. I'm sorry, I know that hurt, but it had to be said. Just because we cannot imagine a good outcome does not mean there are no good outcomes, because one would need omniscience to make such a claim. One would need to know all possible outcomes. Since no one short of God can know all possible outcomes, one cannot claim that no greater goods emerged from a particular situation. Stephen Wickstra, professor of philosophy at Calvin College, explains it using the analogy of an empty garage. A person could peek into an empty garage and declare with confidence that there is no dog in the garage. A person cannot, however, peek into an empty garage and declare whether or not there are fleas in the garage. Such an observation is beyond the ability of the human eye. Another analogy is the infant getting a shot at the doctor's office. The infant can only comprehend the pain and cannot understand why. The infant cannot comprehend that the shot will only cause a brief pain, but will ultimately vaccinate them from future pain and suffering. In conclusion, we may witness acts of horrendous evil that appear pointless, but since we are fallible humans lacking the gift of omniscience, we cannot say with certainty that there was no greater good that emerged from it, and therefore, God's goodness or existence should not come into question. These evils may provide rational grounds to support an atheist worldview, but it can likewise support a theistic worldview. Thus, the evidential problem of evil is not the undoing of theism. Ultimately, we're told in the Bible that God will one day end all of our pain and suffering for those that believe on His Son, Jesus Christ. Mandatory 3 seconds of evangelism in the video. Check. But before I close, I'd like to leave you with my Jerry Springer final thought. When we see occasions of horrendous suffering, we are all capable of lending a hand, donating our skills, time, and money to alleviate the suffering of those in need. Whether you're a theist, atheist, or agnostic, we're all perfectly capable of helping others. I mean, we could stand amidst all these horrible evils and look up to the sky and say, "Why would you let this happen, God?" Or, "Why aren't you doing anything about this?" But couldn't God ask us the very same thing? Why do we let these things happen? Why aren't we doing anything about it? There are so many proactive and reactive steps we could be taking, yet we do nothing. How many times are we like the atheist pig in this comic, standing around idly watching the horror unfold, blaming everyone and everything while never acknowledging our own duty to each other as human beings? In the words of the late Michael Jackson, let us start with the man in the mirror. Let us ask him to change his ways.